When your marriage feels over but you still love them, God is working in the silence. When love is still alive but the marriage feels emotionally over, the silence inside the house becomes louder than any argument. You sleep beside someone you prayed for, and yet you feel alone, anxious, overwhelmed, asking God why nothing is changing, and why every prayer seems to return without an answer. You are not the only one living this contradiction between faith and emotional exhaustion, between still loving and not knowing how to keep going. And this is the part no one talks about, because while you think the distance means the end, God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit are working in a place you cannot see, in the silence that is breaking your control and rebuilding your peace. Stay here, because today you will understand what this season really means for your heart and for your marriage. Every day, God has a word for you here on this channel. The day you realized love was still there, but the marriage was not. There is a quiet moment when this truth stops being a suspicion and becomes a weight inside your chest. Nothing visibly ended. There was no final conversation, no dramatic door closing, yet you felt it. You were sitting in the same room, hearing the same voice, seeing the same face you once associated with safety, and something inside you whispered that the connection that used to carry your love was no longer there. That is the day confusion begins, because your heart is still fully present while the relationship you built together feels emotionally absent. You still care about how their day went. You still think about their needs. You still want to share the small details that once made you feel close. But the response you receive no longer meets you in the same place. This is where the internal conflict becomes exhausting. You start revisiting your own behavior, measuring your words, analyzing your tone, wondering if you changed, if you failed, if you became too much or not enough. You replay memories of when the laughter was natural, when eye contact carried warmth, when silence meant peace and not distance. And the most painful part is that your love did not decrease with time. It matured, it deepened, it became more intentional, but it no longer finds a place to rest. You are loving in an environment that no longer knows how to receive what you are giving. Many people try to survive in this stage by living emotionally in the past. They hold on to what the marriage used to be as if memories could generate present connection. They become loyal to moments instead of being honest about the current reality. But God does not work inside illusions. He works in truth. And this is why this realization, as painful as it is, becomes sacred. Because the day you finally admit that the love is still alive in you but the marriage is not in the same place, you stop negotiating with appearances and you begin to stand before God with sincerity. This is not the destruction of your story. This is the exposure of the real condition of your heart and of your covenant. As long as you believed that everything was just a phase, you kept trying to revive something that needed transformation, not repetition. You were trying to recreate an old dynamic, instead of allowing God to introduce a new level of emotional and spiritual maturity. And that effort drained you, because you were fighting to bring back what once existed instead of understanding what this season was asking from you. There is also a deep grief that comes with this awareness. It is the grief of realizing that being physically together does not guarantee emotional unity. It is the grief of discovering that commitment on paper does not always mean connection in the soul. And yet, in the middle of that grief, your capacity to love remains intact. That is not weakness. That is evidence that God built something real inside you. Your love did not disappear because it was never sustained only by the response of the other person. It was sustained by the covenant you made and by the character that God formed in you. This is where a holy separation begins to happen inside your own heart. You begin to understand that your identity cannot be attached to how loved you feel on a specific day. You begin to see that your peace cannot depend on whether the other person is emotionally available or distant. And this is not indifference. This is alignment. Because when your soul stops begging for connection and starts standing in truth, you create space for God to work in a way that emotional desperation never allowed. God often begins his deepest work not by changing the external situation, but by removing your dependence on what is unstable. He brings you to the point where you can no longer pretend that everything is fine, not to humiliate your hope, but to relocate your heart in Him. The day you realized that love was still there but the marriage was not in the same place was the day your faith left the surface and entered a deeper dimension. Now you are no longer loving only with expectation. You are learning to love with discernment, with boundaries, with spiritual awareness, and with a peace that does not collapse every time the atmosphere in your home changes. And this awakening, even though it hurts, is the first movement of restoration. Because God does not restore what is hidden under denial. He restores what is brought into the light. When you accept the truth of this season, you stop trying to force life into something that is emotionally asleep, and you begin to allow Him to rebuild from the inside out. Not starting with the other person, but starting with you, with your perception, with your identity, with the way you understand love, presence, and covenant. And once this internal shift happens, you will begin to see that sharing the same house does not always mean sharing the same reality, and that is where the next part of this journey begins to unfold. When presence turns into distance, inside the same house. You wake up in the same space, follow the same routines, hear the same sounds, yet something essential is missing. There was a time when simply being in the same room created a sense of belonging. Now the physical closeness only exposes the emotional distance. You sit at the table together, and the silence is not peaceful anymore. It is heavy, filled with unspoken questions, with words you no longer know how to say, without starting another cycle of frustration. And this is what makes this season so disorienting, because from the outside nothing seems broken, but inside you feel like you are living with someone who is slowly becoming unreachable. This kind of distance is deeper than separation. When two people are apart, at least the absence is clear. But when the distance grows inside the same house, confusion takes over the heart. You begin to question your perception. You ask yourself if you are imagining things, if this coldness is only a phase, if your need for connection is unreasonable. You try to normalize the lack of conversation, the absence of eye contact, the mechanical interactions that replaced spontaneous affection. You adapt your expectations just to avoid feeling disappointed again. And little by little you start shrinking emotionally in a place where you were meant to grow. God does not ignore this hidden suffering. In fact, this environment becomes one of the most powerful classrooms for the soul. Because when presence no longer guarantees connection, He begins to teach you the difference between proximity and unity. You discover that being under the same roof does not mean being spiritually aligned. You learn that a covenant is not sustained by shared logistics, but by shared life. And this realization hurts because it confronts the illusion that time alone would fix what only transformation can heal. There is also a silent temptation that appears in this stage. It is the temptation to disconnect emotionally as a form of self-protection. You start telling yourself that you no longer care as much, that you will stop trying, that you will lower your emotional investment. But every time you do that, something inside you resists because your heart was not created for indifference. You were not built to coexist without communion, and this internal tension between protecting yourself and remaining faithful to love becomes exhausting. This is where God begins a very delicate work. He allows you to feel the contrast between what your marriage looks like and what your soul knows it was designed to be. Not to create resentment, but to awaken discernment. Because as long as you were calling this distance normal, you were adapting to a level of connection that does not reflect the covenant you made. Now your spirit is no longer comfortable with emotional survival. You start to perceive that peace cannot exist where authenticity is absent. In this same house where conversations became short and interactions became functional, God starts building an inner room inside you that no one else can access. A place where your stability is not defined by the emotional climate around you. You begin to pray without needing to be noticed. You begin to find strength without external validation. You begin to experience moments of clarity in the middle of an atmosphere that still feels uncertain. And this is not escape. This is preparation. Because when your peace is no longer dependent on shared moods, You stop reacting to every sign of distance. You stop measuring your worth by the level of attention you receive. You stop living in emotional alert mode. And in that moment, something changes in the spiritual environment of your home. Not because the other person has transformed yet, but because you are no longer feeding the cycle of anxiety and control. Heaven always responds when one heart returns to alignment. Living in the same house with someone who feels far away forces you to confront a truth that many people spend years avoiding. Love cannot survive only on structure. It needs presence, intention, and spiritual connection. And when these are missing, God does not immediately remove you from the situation. He first forms in you a new kind of stability, a peace that is not passive but rooted, a love that is not desperate but conscious. You begin to understand that your emotional life cannot remain imprisoned inside the behavior of another person. And as this inner transformation grows, you start seeing the environment differently. The same rooms that once felt like witnesses of distance begin to become places of personal encounter with God. The same silence that once suffocated you begins to reveal your own thoughts, your own fears, your own healing process. The house did not change yet, but your position inside it did. And this shift prepares you to understand why there are seasons where nothing seems to move on the outside, while everything is being rebuilt in the invisible. God's work in the season where nothing moves. This is the season that tests your faith more than conflict ever did. When there were arguments, at least there was movement. When there were conversations, even difficult ones, you felt that something was still alive. But now everything seems suspended. No visible progress, no clear answers, no emotional breakthroughs. You pray, and the atmosphere remains the same. You try to change your attitude and nothing around you responds. And this stillness begins to create a dangerous interpretation inside your mind that God is not acting. But heaven does its deepest work in environments where human effort reaches its limit. When you could still fix things with words, with gestures, with strategies, you were at the center of the process. Now that nothing you do produces immediate results, God brings you to a place where transformation is no longer dependent on your control. This kind of silence is not empty. It is structured. It is the ground where roots grow without being seen. Your emotions resist this stage because you were trained to associate divine action with visible change. You expected signs, quick adjustments, moments that would reassure your heart that the restoration had already begun, and instead, you received continuity. The same routines, the same distance, the same unanswered questions. What you did not perceive is that this continuity was exposing the areas where your faith was still connected to outcomes. You were believing, but you were still needing proof to remain at peace. God's work in this season begins in your inner rhythm. You start to notice that your reactions are no longer the same. Situations that would have broken you emotionally before now produce reflection instead of despair. You begin to observe more and react less. You pray with fewer words, but with more truth. You no longer try to force conversations at the wrong time. You no longer measure every day by the behavior of your spouse. This is not resignation. This is spiritual maturity being formed in real time. There is also a hidden purification happening in your expectations. You are learning the difference between believing in restoration and demanding immediate resolution. You are discovering that hope does not need urgency to remain alive. And this changes the way you stand before God. Your prayers become less anxious and more aligned. Instead of asking Him to change the situation quickly, you begin to ask Him to sustain your heart correctly. This shift moves you from emotional survival to spiritual positioning. While you see no external movement, God is reorganizing internal structures that will sustain whatever comes next. He is healing patterns that you carried into the marriage without realizing. He is confronting your fear of abandonment, your need for constant reassurance, your tendency to assume responsibility for everything. He is separating your identity from your role as a spouse so that you do not disappear emotionally inside the covenant. This work cannot be rushed because it is not about fixing a moment. It is about rebuilding a foundation. This is also the season where your love is redefined. Before, your love was often a response to what you received. Now it becomes a decision connected to your character and to your relationship with God. You begin to understand that loving someone does not mean losing your emotional center. You begin to love without chasing, to care without controlling, to remain present without dissolving your own peace. This kind of love is not born in moments of emotional intensity. It is formed in prolonged silence. From the outside, nothing changed, but inside you are no longer the same person who entered this season. Your stability is growing, your discernment is sharper, your dependence on God is no longer a reaction to crisis, but a daily alignment. And this is where many people give up, because they misinterpret the absence of visible results as divine inactivity. They leave the process exactly when the deepest transformations are taking shape. God works in layers that your eyes cannot measure. While you are waiting for a change in the relationship, He is creating the emotional and spiritual conditions that will make any future change sustainable. Because if the external situation had shifted before your inner structure was ready, you would have repeated the same patterns that brought you here. This stillness is protection. It prevents premature solutions that would only recreate the same cycle. There is a holy patience being formed in you, not the patience that tolerates everything, but the patience that remains aligned without losing clarity. You are learning to live one day at a time, without turning every moment into a verdict about your future. You are discovering that peace can exist even when answers have not arrived yet. And this peace becomes the first visible sign that God is moving, because it does not come from the environment. It comes from the transformation of your own soul. And as this internal movement grows, you begin to understand that the silence was never the absence of God. It was the environment He chose to work in the deepest parts of your life. The question is no longer why nothing is changing around you. The question becomes what is being rebuilt inside you that will redefine the way you live this covenant from now on. The collapse of the perfect marriage image. One of the most painful moments in this journey is not the distance, not the silence, not even the unanswered prayers. It is the day the image you built in your heart about what your marriage was supposed to be finally breaks. For years you carried a vision. You believed in a certain kind of partnership, a certain atmosphere, a certain emotional safety. You imagined growing together, understanding each other without so many explanations, supporting one another naturally. That image became part of your faith. It was not only a dream, it was something you presented to God with gratitude in advance. And now you are standing in a reality that does not look like what you believed you received from Him. This collapse creates a very specific pain because it touches your spiritual interpretation of your own story. You start asking questions you never thought you would ask. Was I wrong when I believed this was from God? Did I misunderstand His will? Did I fail somewhere along the way? This is where many hearts become divided, not only in relation to the marriage, but in relation to God Himself. Because when the promise you thought you were living no longer reflects what you see, your faith feels disoriented. But God never asked you to have a perfect image. He asked you to live a real covenant. The image was built with expectations, with references, with the desire to avoid pain, with the hope that love would always be naturally reciprocated. That image was sustained by moments that were true, but it was not prepared for seasons of transformation. And when reality stopped feeding that image, the frustration was inevitable. Not because the covenant lost its value, but because the fantasy of permanence without process could not survive. There is something sacred in the breaking of this internal picture, because as long as you were trying to protect the idea of a perfect marriage, you could not see the real dynamics that needed healing. You were interpreting everything through the filter of what should be happening, instead of what was actually happening. You minimized your own pain to maintain the appearance that everything was still aligned. You accepted emotional distance as a temporary phase because the alternative was to admit that your story had entered a place you did not know how to navigate. When this image collapses, you feel exposed. You no longer have a narrative to hide behind. You are face to face with the truth of your relationship, with the truth of your own heart, and with the truth of your dependence on a model that God never promised would remain unchanged. This is not the destruction of your marriage. This is the removal of an expectation that prevented real intimacy from being rebuilt on honest ground. Because a covenant is not sustained by perfection, it is sustained by transformation. And transformation requires that the illusion of constant harmony dies. It requires that both people are seen in their real state, not in the idealized version that once existed. The breaking of the image allows you to stop loving a memory and start discerning a person again. It forces you to confront the difference between what you hoped for and what is actually possible in this season. This is also the moment where your identity begins to detach from the success or failure of the marriage. When the image was intact, your sense of stability was connected to how closely your reality matched that vision. Now you are learning to stand before God without presenting a perfect story. You are learning to pray without trying to prove that everything is fine. You are learning to exist without needing to defend your relationship, as if its condition defined your value. There is humility in this place, a deep, quiet humility that says to God that you no longer want to live inside expectations that keep you from seeing the truth. And this humility opens a new level of spiritual clarity. You begin to perceive that the covenant was never meant to be an escape from personal growth. It was meant to be a path where two people would be continually transformed. When one or both stop growing, the structure remains, but the life inside it weakens. God allows the image to fall because He is not interested in maintaining appearances. He is interested in building something that can survive reality. And reality includes seasons of distance, of questioning, of rebuilding from places you never imagined you would reach. When the perfect image dies, something more honest can be born. A love that does not depend on constant emotional confirmation. A faith that does not collapse when the story takes an unexpected direction. A peace that is not based on everything looking right from the outside. You are not losing the promise. You are losing the illusion that the promise would come without process. And once you stop trying to restore the image, you become available for God to restore what is real. Not the version that existed in your mind, but the covenant in its true depth, with all the work, all the healing, and all the maturity that this season is producing inside you. Loving without being emotionally received. There is a kind of pain that almost no one sees because from the outside, you are still there, still present, still doing what you have always done. You care, you listen, you try to maintain peace, you choose your words carefully, you remain faithful to the commitment you made. But inside, you carry the weight of loving someone who no longer meets you in the same emotional place. Your gestures are no longer mirrored. Your efforts no longer create connection. Your presence no longer produces warmth. And yet your love did not decrease. It continued to grow in an environment where it is not fully received. This experience creates a silent questioning about your own value. You begin to wonder if the way you love is too much, too deep, too intense. You measure your expressions. You reduce your expectations. You train yourself not to feel disappointment every time there is no response. You become careful with your own heart, not because you stopped loving, but because you are trying to protect what is still alive inside you. And this constant self-regulation is exhausting, because love was never meant to be calculated in order to survive. There is also a loneliness that is different from physical solitude. It is the loneliness of giving without knowing where what you give is landing. You offer patience and receive distance. You offer understanding and receive silence. You offer presence and receive absence even when the person is right in front of you. And this creates a deep internal tension because your faith tells you to persevere, but your emotions are asking how long you can continue pouring from a place that is not being replenished. God sees this hidden faithfulness. He sees the way you choose not to respond with coldness. He sees the restraint in your words, the prayers you make without telling anyone, the nights when you reorganize your thoughts so that bitterness does not take root. Loving without being emotionally received does not make you weak. It reveals the level of transformation that He has already produced in you, because natural love only flows when it is reciprocated. Covenant love remains even when it is not immediately returned. But there is something He begins to teach you in this stage that changes everything. Loving someone does not mean abandoning yourself. Remaining faithful to your heart does not mean accepting emotional invisibility. You start to understand that your love cannot continue being an attempt to awaken the other person. It must become an expression of who you are before God. When this shift happens, your love stops being a request for response and becomes a position of character. This does not make the distance disappear immediately, but it transforms the way you stand inside it. You are no longer loving to obtain connection. You are loving because your identity is rooted in a source that does not fluctuate according to human reactions. You stop measuring your day by how much attention you received. You stop interpreting silence as rejection. You begin to live from a place of inner supply that the other person cannot interrupt. There is also a purification of intention happening here. Before, part of your effort carried the hope that if you loved enough, the relationship would return to what it was. Now your love becomes free from that negotiation. You are no longer trying to generate a specific outcome. You are allowing God to shape your heart into something stable, mature, and whole. And this frees you from the cycle of emotional highs and lows that were controlled by external responses. In this process, you begin to recover your emotional space. You rediscover things that bring you peace without needing to share them immediately. You cultivate your relationship with God in a more personal and less reactive way. You stop waiting for the right moment to feel alive again. And this is not withdrawal. This is restoration of your inner life, because you cannot continue offering life to a relationship if you are not being sustained from within. Loving without being emotionally received also reveals the difference between connection and dependency. You see that your desire for unity is legitimate, but your survival does not depend on it. Your stability does not collapse because of the distance. Your value does not decrease because the other person is in a different emotional place. And this awareness creates a new kind of peace, a peace that is not based on what you receive, but on what God is forming in you. From this place, your love becomes more conscious. It is no longer driven by fear of loss or by the need to fix everything. It becomes calm, intentional, and free from desperation. You continue to care, but you no longer dissolve when there is no response. You remain present, but you no longer disappear inside the atmosphere of the other person. And this new posture changes the spiritual environment around you, because heaven always responds to a heart that loves from alignment and not from need. This is not the end of your capacity to connect. It is the moment where your love is being elevated to a level that can sustain truth, boundaries, and peace at the same time. And as this transformation deepens, you begin to perceive that something inside you is being strengthened in a way that no external validation could ever produce, preparing you for the next stage of this journey where the weight of praying alone begins to reveal a different kind of strength. The spiritual fatigue of praying for two. There comes a point where your prayers no longer feel like moments of comfort. They begin to feel like responsibility. You enter your room, you close your eyes, and instead of rest, you feel the weight of carrying a covenant on your shoulders alone. You present the same names, the same situations, the same requests, and even though your faith is still alive, your emotions are tired. You are not tired of God. You are tired of feeling that if you stop interceding, everything will collapse. This fatigue is different from doubt. You still believe. You still expect God to move. But your soul is asking how long one heart can sustain what was designed to be carried by two. You look at your spouse and you do not see the same level of spiritual engagement. You do not see the same urgency for healing, the same hunger for restoration, the same awareness of what is at stake. And a silent question begins to form inside you that you are almost afraid to say in prayer. God, am I the only one fighting for this? Many people feel guilty at this stage because they think that being tired in prayer means lack of faith. But spiritual fatigue is not the absence of belief. It is the evidence that you have been standing for a long time without visible support. You remained when it would have been easier to disconnect. You spoke life when the atmosphere was cold. You protected the covenant in your conversations with others. You honored the story, even when you did not understand the present. And now your heart is asking for renewal. God does not ignore this exhaustion. In fact, this is where He begins to change the way you pray. Before, your intercession was driven by urgency. You prayed trying to move heaven quickly, trying to generate a breakthrough, trying to keep everything from falling apart. Now He invites you into a different rhythm, a prayer that is not based on pressure, but on alignment. A prayer where you no longer feel responsible for transforming the other person, but where you present your heart and allow Him to sustain you first. This shift is delicate because for a long time your sense of purpose was connected to being the one who holds everything together spiritually. You believed that your consistency in prayer was the barrier that prevented the complete disintegration of the relationship. And in many ways, your faith did create protection. But now God is showing you that you are not the savior of your marriage. You are part of it. You are faithful to it. But you are not the one who carries the power of transformation. When you accept this, something inside you begins to rest again. Your prayers become more honest. You stop trying to sound strong before God. You begin to tell Him that you are tired, that you need to be held to, that you cannot continue presenting strength while feeling empty. And this honesty does not push Him away. It brings you closer. Because prayer was never meant to be a performance of faith. It was always meant to be a place of encounter. In this new place, your intercession becomes lighter but deeper. You do not pray more words. You pray with more truth. You are no longer trying to convince God to act. You are allowing Him to reorder your heart. You start to experience moments where peace arrives before any external change. You feel strength that does not come from your own effort. And you realize that heaven was never asking you to pray from exhaustion, but from communion. There is also a restoration of your personal relationship with God happening here. For a long time, your prayers were almost entirely about the marriage. Every conversation with Him carried the same focus. Now He begins to draw you back to Himself, not as the one who will fix everything immediately, but as the one who sustains your identity beyond your role as a spouse. You start to remember who you are outside the crisis. You begin to experience God not only as the restorer of your story, but as the restorer of your soul. This does not mean you stop praying for the relationship. It means your prayer is no longer a desperate attempt to control the outcome. It becomes a place where you receive life again. And when you receive life, your love stops coming from depletion. Your words stop carrying hidden frustration. Your silence stops being heavy. You are no longer praying from fear of losing everything. You are praying from the certainty that God is present, even in the process you do not understand. The fatigue you felt was not a sign to give up. It was an invitation to change position, to stop standing before God as the only one responsible for the miracle, and to start standing as a son or daughter who is also being cared for. And when this new posture is established, you begin to perceive that while you were praying for two, God was healing you in ways that will define how you live every relationship from this point forward. What is being healed in you while you wait? While your eyes are fixed on what is not changing in your marriage, God is moving in areas of your heart that were never exposed until this season began. Waiting has a way of revealing what activity hides. When everything was working, you did not notice how much of your peace depended on being emotionally affirmed. You did not see how quickly your stability shifted when the atmosphere changed. You did not realize how much of your identity was connected to being needed, being heard, being chosen every day in visible ways. Now, in the stillness, these foundations are being brought into the light, not to shame you, but to heal you. This is the part of the process that feels confusing because it seems unrelated to the restoration you are asking for. You are praying for unity, for communication, for reconnection, and God begins to deal with your fear of abandonment. You are asking Him to change the other person, and He starts addressing the way you internalize silence as rejection. You want an external breakthrough, and He invites you into internal freedom. At first it feels like a delay, but in reality, it is preparation. Because if your heart remained dependent on constant reassurance, any temporary improvement would become another cycle of anxiety. There are wounds that only appear in environments where you cannot control the outcome. Patterns from your past, ways you learned to protect yourself, expectations you carried into the marriage without knowing. Waiting exposes the difference between loving from wholeness and loving from the need to be completed. It shows you where you lost your voice to maintain peace, where you ignored your own emotions to avoid conflict, where you confused patience with self-erasure. And none of this is being revealed to condemn you. It is being revealed so that your love can exist without losing your soul. God's healing in this season is not loud. It does not always come with intense emotional moments. It comes through awareness, through the way you begin to pause before reacting, through the way you no longer interpret every distant gesture as a personal failure, through the way you start to give yourself permission to feel without immediately trying to fix everything. You are learning to remain present with your own heart, and this changes the way you stand in the relationship. Because a person who is internally aligned no longer loves from fear, there is also a restoration of your personal dignity happening quietly. You begin to understand that your value was never determined by how much you were emotionally received. You see that you can remain faithful without becoming invisible. You discover that boundaries are not a sign of coldness, but of maturity. You start to recognize your own needs without guilt, and this does not push you away from the covenant. It places you inside it in a healthier way. You are no longer trying to earn connection. You are offering presence from a place of inner stability. This healing also redefines your relationship with time. Before, every day without visible change increased your anxiety. Now, even though you still desire transformation, your life is no longer suspended waiting for it. You begin to experience moments of genuine peace in the middle of uncertainty. You engage with your own growth, with your own spiritual life, with your own emotional development. You stop postponing your healing until the marriage improves. And this is one of the most powerful shifts because it breaks the belief that your restoration depends on the other person's movement. As God works in you, your discernment becomes clearer. You start to see the difference between what belongs to you and what belongs to the other person. You stop taking responsibility for emotions that are not yours. You stop trying to solve what only they can confront. This separation is not distance. It is respect for the process of each soul. And it frees you from the constant pressure of feeling that everything depends on your ability to love more, to pray more, to endure more. What is being healed in you during this waiting is your capacity to remain whole in any season. Your peace is becoming less fragile. Your love is becoming less reactive. Your faith is becoming less dependent on immediate answers. You are discovering that God's first commitment is not to restore a structure, but to restore a person. Because when you are healed, you will no longer enter any relationship, even your own marriage, from a place of fear or emotional hunger. You will enter from a place of truth, and this changes the entire meaning of waiting. You are not standing in a passive delay. You are participating in a deep transformation that will define the way you love for the rest of your life. The external situation may still look the same, but internally, you are no longer the same person who started this journey. Your heart is being strengthened, your identity is being repositioned, and your relationship with God is becoming the primary source of your stability. And from this place, a new understanding begins to emerge about why immediate answers were never the real miracle you needed. When God interrupts your need for immediate answers, there was a time when you believed that clarity would bring you peace. If God only showed you what was going to happen, if He only confirmed whether this marriage would be restored or not, you feel that you could finally rest. Your mind keeps searching for signs, for timelines, for conversations that would define the direction of your future. You measure days by what changed and what did not. You analyze words, gestures, silences, trying to extract a message that will calm the uncertainty. The need for an answer becomes almost as strong as the desire for restoration. But God does something that at first feels uncomfortable. He does not feed your urgency, he interrupts it. Not because your questions are wrong, but because your peace cannot be built on information about the future. As long as your stability depends on knowing what will happen next, your heart will remain vulnerable to every new movement, every new distance, every new moment of hope, followed by silence. Immediate answers would calm your mind for a moment, but they would not heal the anxiety that makes you feel that you cannot live fully until something is resolved. This interruption is one of the most loving acts of God, even though it feels like the opposite. He allows you to live without a defined outcome, so that your faith can detach from scenarios and reconnect to His presence. You begin to learn that peace is not the result of certainty. It is the result of alignment. When your heart stops demanding a conclusion in order to remain stable, you start to experience a different kind of freedom. You wake up and your first thought is no longer what will happen to your marriage, but how you will walk with God today. The need for immediate answers often hides a deeper fear. The fear of investing more time in something that might not change. The fear of being hurt again. The fear of losing years of your life. And these fears are legitimate, but they cannot be the voice that leads your decisions. God sees that if He gave you a definitive answer in the middle of this emotional state, you would interpret it through pain, not through maturity. You would react, not discern. That is why He works first on your inner stability before revealing directions. As this process continues, you begin to notice something different in your daily life. The questions are still there, but they no longer control your emotional climate. You stop checking constantly for signs. You stop trying to force conversations just to reduce uncertainty. You start to live one day at a time with a sense of presence that did not exist before. This does not mean that you stopped caring about the future. It means that the future no longer has permission to steal your present. God is teaching you to trust His movement, even when you do not understand His timing. You are discovering that transformation is not accelerated by anxiety. You are learning that some answers only make sense after your heart is ready to receive them. If He showed you everything now, you would try to manage it, control it, anticipate it. But what He is forming in you is a posture that does not need to control in order to remain at peace. There is also a restoration of your emotional rhythm happening here. Before, your thoughts were constantly ahead of your life. You were living in imagined scenarios, in possible outcomes, in conversations that had not happened yet. Now, your mind begins to slow down. You become more present in simple moments. You rediscover the ability to feel gratitude even in the middle of uncertainty. This is not denial. This is healing. Because anxiety about the future loses strength when your soul learns to inhabit the present. This does not mean that direction will never come. It means that when it comes, it will find you in a place of stability, and not in a place of desperation. You will be able to discern without fear, to decide without reacting, to move without abandoning your peace. Immediate answers would give you relief. This process gives you transformation. Relief is temporary. Transformation becomes part of who you are. And this is where your relationship with God changes in a profound way. You stop seeking Him only as the one who will tell you what will happen, and you begin to walk with Him as the one who sustains you regardless of what happens. Your faith becomes less transactional and more relational. You are no longer waiting for a conclusion to feel secure. You are learning to live inside His presence as your primary certainty. When the urgency for immediate answers loses its power, something inside you becomes very quiet in the best possible way. Not the silence of confusion, but the silence of trust. And from this place of trust, you will be able to enter the next stage of this journey, where control finally loses its influence and surrender becomes the beginning of a new kind of strength. The sacred space where control finally ends. For a long time, you believed that if you found the right words, the right moment, the right attitude, you could influence the outcome of everything that is happening. You adjusted your tone, you calculated your reactions, you held back what you wanted to say, you anticipated possible conflicts, you tried to maintain an emotional environment that would make connection easier. Without noticing, you took responsibility for the atmosphere of the relationship. Control did not always look like domination. It often looked like effort, like care, like the desire to protect what you still believed in. But inside that constant management, there was a silent fear that if you stopped, everything would fall apart. This is the stage where God brings you to the end of your own strategies, not because your intentions were wrong, but because your soul cannot live in permanent tension, trying to sustain something that only He can transform. The sacred space begins the day you recognize that your love cannot be proven by how much you carry. Your faith cannot be measured by how much you endure in silence. Your value is not determined by your ability to hold everything together. Control created the illusion that you were preventing the collapse, but at the same time it was preventing you from resting in God. Letting go of control does not happen in a single prayer. It is a sequence of internal decisions. You notice that you no longer need to monitor every reaction. You stop revisiting conversations in your mind, trying to correct them. You accept that there are emotions in the other person that you cannot access or resolve. This acceptance is not indifference. It is respect for the limit between what belongs to you and what belongs to them. And this respect brings an unexpected relief, because you realize how much weight you were carrying that was never yours. In this sacred space, your communication changes. You no longer speak to generate a specific response. You speak from truth, and then you release the outcome. You no longer adjust your entire day based on the emotional signals you receive. You maintain your inner rhythm even when the external environment remains unstable. This is where your peace begins to stop fluctuating, not because everything is resolved, but because you are no longer trying to control what you cannot heal. There is also a deep confrontation with fear in this process. Control was a way to avoid the possibility of loss. As long as you were managing everything, you felt that you were doing your part to guarantee a future. Surrender exposes you to uncertainty. It requires you to trust God without using your own effort as emotional insurance. And this is where faith moves from theory to experience. You are no longer trusting in the combination of your actions and God's help. You are trusting in Him even when your actions are no longer trying to manipulate the result. This surrender creates a new internal posture. You start to occupy your own life again. Your thoughts are no longer consumed by analysis of the relationship every hour of the day. You begin to give attention to your spiritual growth, to your emotional health, to the things that bring you life, not as a distraction, but as restoration. Control had reduced your world to one central concern. Surrender returns you to a full existence where your identity is larger than the crisis you are facing. And something subtle begins to change in the environment. When one person stops operating from anxiety and control, the entire dynamic loses its previous pattern. The tension that was fed by your constant effort is no longer there. Your presence becomes calmer. Your words carry less pressure. Your silence is no longer heavy. This does not force the other person to change, but it creates a different atmosphere where real transformation becomes possible because it is no longer being demanded. In this sacred space, you discover a new form of strength. Not the strength of endurance, but the strength of alignment. You are still committed, still present, still loving, but you are no longer trying to be the source of the miracle. You return the responsibility of the process to God. And when you do that, your relationship with Him deepens in a way that was impossible while you were trying to control everything. You start to experience moments of genuine rest, even in the middle of uncertainty. This is where your love becomes free. Free from the need to prove, free from the need to fix, free from the fear that if you do less, everything will be lost. You continue to care, but now your care flows from peace and not from urgency. And this freedom is not only for you. It becomes an invitation for the other person to encounter a version of you that is no longer reacting to every movement. A version that reflects stability and truth. The end of control is not the end of your participation. It is the beginning of your real position inside the covenant. A position where you stand whole, where your faith is not conditioned by results, where your heart is available for whatever God will do next without losing its center. And from this place of surrender, a new revelation starts to grow. Because when control ends, you are finally able to see yourself again beyond the response you receive. rediscovering your worth. Without your spouse's response. For a long time, even without realizing it, your emotional value was being measured by the way you were received. A good day was when there was warmth, attention, some sign that the connection was still alive. A difficult day was when there was distance, silence, indifference. Little by little, your sense of stability began to fluctuate according to reactions that you could not control. And this created a hidden dependence, because your peace was no longer rooted in who you are before God, but in how your love was being mirrored. This is why this season feels so disorienting. It is not only about the marriage, it is about the place where your identity was positioned. When the response of the other person became uncertain, your perception of yourself also started to become unstable. You questioned your attractiveness, your importance, your ability to be loved, your emotional value. You looked at your efforts, and because they were not producing the connection you expected, you interpreted that as a reflection of your own worth. God does not allow this process to continue, because your identity cannot remain attached to a human response. The covenant was never meant to define your value. It was meant to be an expression of two whole people walking together. So in this season, while the external affirmation decreases, He begins to rebuild your internal recognition. And this reconstruction is quiet. It does not come through applause, through visible change, through immediate restoration. It comes through awareness. You start to notice that you are still the same person when no one is affirming you. Your capacity to love did not diminish. Your character did not weaken. Your faith is still standing. Your sensitivity is still alive. All the qualities that made you enter this covenant continue to exist, even when they are not being acknowledged in the way you expected. And this realization is powerful because it separates your essence from the current dynamic of the relationship. There is a moment where you stop asking, even unconsciously, to be chosen again in order to feel secure. You understand that you were already chosen by God before any human relationship began. This is not a spiritual phrase. It becomes a lived experience. Your time with Him stops being only intercession for the marriage and becomes a place where your identity is reaffirmed. You begin to hear internally what you no longer depend on hearing externally. You are loved. You are seen. You are not forgotten. As this truth grows, your posture changes naturally. You no longer enter interactions needing validation. You are present because you want to be present, not because you are trying to confirm your importance. You speak without the hidden fear of being ignored. You remain silent without interpreting it as rejection. Your emotional climate becomes more stable because it is no longer defined by daily responses. And this stability is visible. It carries a calm that does not come from circumstances. Rediscovering your worth also heals the way you relate to your own needs. Before, you minimized them so that the relationship would not become more fragile. You accepted less connection, less communication, less presence, telling yourself that it was temporary. Now you begin to recognize that your need for emotional reciprocity is not weakness. It is part of the design of the covenant. But instead of trying to force the other person to meet that need, you bring it first to God, and then you learn to express it from a place of dignity. This dignity is not confrontation. It is clarity. You no longer disappear to keep peace. You no longer accept emotional invisibility as normal. You position yourself with respect, without aggression, without fear. And this is only possible because your worth is no longer on the table to be negotiated. You are not asking for value. You are living from value. Something very deep happens when this internal restoration takes place. Your love becomes freer. It is no longer a request to be recognized. It becomes a conscious offering. You care without losing yourself. You remain without shrinking. You invest without feeling that your existence depends on the return. This kind of love carries strength because it is connected to identity and not to approval. This process also removes the silent comparison that often lives inside the heart. You stop looking at other couples, at other stories, at other versions of marriage, and asking why your reality is different. Your journey becomes personal again. Your relationship with God becomes the main reference for your value. And from this place you experience a peace that does not need constant confirmation. Rediscovering your worth without your spouse's response does not distance you from the covenant. It allows you to stand inside it as a whole person. It prepares you to discern without fear, to love without dependency, to remain without losing your center, or to move forward if God leads you in another direction. Because now your identity is no longer at risk. It is anchored. And when your worth is restored, your perception changes. You begin to see that God was not using this season to diminish you, but to return you to yourself, to the person you were before you started measuring your value through reactions, to the person who knows who they are even in silence. And from this place, a new sensitivity begins to emerge, because you start to perceive small movements that before were invisible, signs that heaven is still present in your story, even when everything seems unchanged. The quiet signs that heaven is still involved in your story. There was a time when you believed that if God were truly acting, you would see something undeniable. A sudden change, a decisive conversation, a visible softening, a clear direction. You associated divine movement with dramatic evidence. But in this season, heaven begins to speak in a different language, not the language of spectacle, but the language of subtlety. And if your heart is still conditioned to expect noise, you will miss the sacred things that are already happening. The first sign is not around you, it is within you. You notice that the same situations that used to destabilize you completely no longer have the same power. The silence is still there, the distance is still there, the uncertainty is still there, but your soul is not collapsing the way it did before. There is a new kind of calm that does not come from resolution. It comes from alignment. And this calm is not emotional numbness. It is the evidence that God is sustaining you from a place deeper than your circumstances. You begin to perceive moments of unexpected clarity, thoughts that arrive without anxiety, decisions that are no longer driven by fear, words that you choose not to say because you no longer need to defend your position every time. These are not coincidences. This is the work of the Holy Spirit reorganizing your internal world. You are being guided in the way you think, in the way you speak, in the way you position yourself. And this guidance often happens without external confirmation because it is forming discernment inside you. Another quiet sign is the change in your prayer life. You are no longer praying only from urgency. You find yourself entering moments of communion without the same pressure to present a list of requests. You remain in God's presence even when you do not have new words. You feel a peace that arrives before any answer. This is heaven reminding you that your relationship with Him is not dependent on the outcome of your marriage. And this restoration of intimacy is one of the greatest miracles of this season. There are also small external shifts that would have gone unnoticed before. A conversation that is slightly more respectful, a reaction that is less defensive, a moment where the atmosphere is lighter for no clear reason. They are not complete transformations, but they are interruptions in the previous pattern. When your heart is no longer desperate for immediate restoration, you begin to recognize these movements as what they are. Not the final result, but signs that the process is alive. Heaven's involvement is also visible in the way doors inside you are opening. You return to things that bring you life. You recover your concentration. You start to take care of your emotional and spiritual health without feeling guilty. You begin to smile again in moments where before there was only tension. This is not distraction. This is restoration of your soul. God does not only work on the structure of your marriage. He works on the life inside you that was suffocated by the weight of this crisis. You also notice that your reactions to the other person are different. Not because you stopped caring, but because you are no longer interpreting everything as a threat. You can listen without immediately preparing a defense. You can remain silent without creating internal narratives. You can be present without trying to control the direction of the interaction. This is maturity being formed, and maturity is one of the clearest signs that God is still writing your story. Another subtle movement is the return of hope without anxiety. Not the hope that demands a specific ending, but the hope that trusts that whatever God is doing will lead to life. You no longer need to imagine scenarios to feel secure. You no longer measure your future by today's atmosphere. There is a quiet confidence growing in you that did not exist before. And this confidence does not come from what you see. It comes from what God is building in the invisible. These signs are easy to ignore because they do not satisfy the urgency of your heart. But they are the real evidence of divine presence. Heaven does not always announce itself with noise. Often it reveals itself through stability, through clarity, through the return of peace in places that were dominated by fear. You are not abandoned in this process. You're being guided in a way that respects your transformation, and not only your expectations. When you start recognizing these quiet signs, your entire perception of the season changes. You stop asking if God is working, and you begin to ask what He is forming. Your attention moves from the absence of immediate answers to the presence of continuous care. And this shift prepares your heart for the deepest understanding of this journey. Because once you can see that heaven is still involved, you are ready to understand how silence itself can become the place where love is reborn. When silence becomes the place where love is reborn. There was a time when you feared the silence because you believed it was the evidence that everything was ending. Silence meant distance. Distance meant loss. And loss meant that all the prayers, all the years, all the effort had led you to an empty place. But now, after everything that has been rebuilt inside you, the silence no longer carries the same meaning. It is no longer the space where your anxiety grows. It has become the environment where something new can finally be born without the pressure of old expectations. Love cannot be reborn in noise. It cannot grow while both hearts are defending themselves, reacting, trying to win, trying to prove. The previous version of your relationship was sustained by dynamics that this season exposed and dismantled. The need for constant reassurance, the fear of conflict, the silent accumulation of frustrations, the roles you both played to maintain an appearance of stability. All of that had to lose its strength so that something real could emerge. And that process only happens in the silence where there is no performance, no immediate reaction, no emotional negotiation. You are no longer the same person who entered this crisis. Your love is no longer anxious. Your identity is no longer dependent on response. Your prayers are no longer desperate. Your peace is no longer fragile. And because you changed, the way love exists inside you also changed. Now it is not an attempt to return to what once was. It is the willingness to live something true, even if it looks completely different from the image you carried for years. This is where many people misunderstand God. They think that rebirth means going back to the way everything used to be. But resurrection never recreates the past. It produces a new life that carries the memory of what existed, but is no longer limited by it. The love that can emerge from this silence is not based on illusion, on emotional dependency, or on unspoken expectations. It is based on truth, on freedom, on two people who can only meet again if they are both standing in reality. And even if the other person is still in their own process, something has already been reborn in you. Your capacity to love without losing yourself, your ability to remain without fear, your discernment to know when to speak and when to be silent, your peace that does not disappear when the atmosphere changes. This is the first expression of reborn love. It begins inside one heart before it can ever be shared by two. Silence also becomes the place where you finally hear God without the interference of your own urgency. Before, every prayer carried a request. Now your communion carries presence. You sit with Him without needing to understand everything. And in that presence you begin to perceive that the greatest restoration was never only about the marriage. It was about bringing you back to a place where your love reflects His character and not your fear. From this place you are no longer trying to force an outcome. You are available for what is true. If there is reconnection, it will not be built on the old foundations. It will be built on two transformed lives. If there is a different direction, you will not walk into it broken. You will walk into it whole. Because the rebirth that God produces in silence is not dependent on the external structure remaining the same. It is the rebirth of your way of loving, your way of living, your way of existing in covenant with Him first. And now you understand why this season was necessary, not to punish you, not to take something away from you, but to bring you to a level of love that is no longer sustained by fear of loss. The silence that once suffocated you became the womb where God formed a new heart, a new mind, a new stability. You are no longer waiting for life to begin again. Life has already begun inside you. This is the moment where your story stops being defined by what you lost and starts being defined by what was transformed. You are standing in the same house, in the same relationship, in the same reality, but you are no longer the same person. And that means that everything from this point forward will be lived from a different place. A place of peace, of clarity, of spiritual authority, of mature love. Silence was never the end. It was the sacred space where God rebuilt you so that love in its purest form could live again. Not as something you are trying to recover, but as something that now flows from who you have become in Him. Thank you for being here with Prayer Revelation. If this message spoke to your heart, stay with us. There's a place for you here.